final exit stroke is the compound curve, and the shape of the end of the compound curve is similar to the shape of the underturn. You'll also notice that this segment of the end of the compound curve is the same approximate shape as this shape. So every time we connect, you've already learned how to connect these shapes to all of these shapes. So the only thing that we're going to add is the fact that this compound curve is one stroke. So when we get all the way down to connecting one compound curve to another compound curve, you'll see that it becomes one compound curve and another compound curve right in a row. But let's just start with the compound curve to the entrance stroke. Just to review the compound curve exit stroke, there are these letters that end with the compound curve, and I'm going to be connecting them to one in each of these groups for the entrance strokes. So let's start with the letter H. The letter H ends in a compound curve. Okay, so if we connect that to a letter that starts with a normal entrance stroke, like the letter I, so this compound curve connects to an entrance stroke like this. So the connection is just a compound curve, and then this segment of the compound curve acts as the entrance stroke to the I. So you can write the word I. Next, let's connect a compound curve to a partial entrance stroke. M, and then the letter E has a partial entrance stroke. So this is basically the same as what we just did, the compound curve, and then instead of going all the way up to the header line, we will end about halfway up. To the last stroke of the M. We want to end it before we get to the header line. So this is where you really need to think ahead and think about the next letter that you're writing so that you know how to connect it. Okay, so there's that connection. Next we have a compound curve to an extended entrance stroke. So this version of the P that I'm about to write ends with a compound curve. And then let's connect that to this version of the R. Okay, so then after we make the compound curve, we want to make sure that we go up and above the header line to start the R. Okay, so the final stroke of the P is a compound curve. We come up above the header line. Sometimes I make like a little loop, or I lift my pen and then make a downstroke before completing the R. Okay, this is where it's going to start to get a little more tricky. We have to connect a compound curve to the overturn. Let's just do, okay, so the letter N, we're connecting a compound curve. It ends with the compound curve. And it starts with an overturn, so that's the connection that we're practicing right now. So we have this compound curve shape, and then the overturn. So right about at this point is when we need to transition from the end of the compound curve to the beginning of the overturn. Okay, so a compound curve. Now instead of going straight up and finishing at the header line, I need to come up and over to make the overturned shape that starts the letter N, which ends with the compound curve. So this stroke on its own looks like a compound curve that goes into an overturn. Now our very last connection is from a compound curve to another compound curve. Let's connect the letter M to the letter Y. Okay, so the M ends with a compound curve and the Y begins with a compound curve. So we connect the two, we join them at about that point. Okay, so the final stroke of the M is a compound curve. And now at this point, I'm thinking about coming up and around. Instead of going straight up, I need to come up and around and make another compound curve. And again, we talked about this earlier, the connection, the space between the letters shouldn't be too wide. So when you're making connections between letters, they should all be about the same. So in this stroke, this is the end of the M. Okay, now we're thinking about connecting to the Y. So I'm going to narrow this gap a little bit. So that this space is the space between the letters, just to make sure that's not too wide. So this is what two compound curves connected looks like. So you'll see, especially with this shape and this shape, when you go from an overturn or a compound curve into another overturned shape, it can help to just practice making lines of this shape to keep your movement fluid and keep the shapes consistent and still on the correct slant line. So really the key is to think ahead, and if you're writing a word that has M and Y next to each other, you really have to think ahead. The last stroke of the M, how do I connect this to the first stroke of the next letter? So if you ever have a combination of letters that you can't figure out, or if I didn't show that exact example, you can always look at the formulas we went over. So figure out how the letter ends, and then figure out how the next letter starts. And just practice writing the last stroke of the first letter and the first stroke of the last letter, and figure out how to combine them. And then just practice that connection. So then when you end the first letter, you can go right into the second letter.